Hello and welcome to this video going in-depth into how the WeakAuras part of my Arms Warrior interface works. The interface is already adjusted for Shadowlands, and if you want to give it a try, you will find the necessary links in the description box. I already made another video building up to this one which explains my guidelines for interface design in general, and I will try not to repeat too much from it. But if you're interested about the foundation for this interface, give it a watch. The video that you are watching right now is split into two major parts. Part 1 will explain the basic icon states which are identical for almost all of my abilities. The basic explanation is also identical for all of my WeakAuras spec videos and takes Arms Warrior as an example, so if you have already seen another one, you can skip to Part 2. Part 2 will go into detail on abilities which go beyond the basic states and contain interesting logic worthy of discussion. We will go group by group and you can find all timestamps in the description box below. With all that out of the way, let's go into the basics. Part 1a – Basic States for Cooldown Abilities. I use icons for abilities which are important enough to be tracked, and pretty much all of them either have a cooldown or need to be refreshed regularly. Every icon also has a fixed position on the screen so you can get used to it and never have to search for it. For abilities with a cooldown, there are up to 6 basic states. If an icon has normal coloring and no other indicators, it means that the ability can be used. You have sufficient resources, a target if necessary, and at least one charge available. If an ability has multiple charges, they will show at the bottom right corner of the icon, and the cooldown for the next charge will be shown with a white timer in the center. After using an ability, the icon will most commonly become invisible, which is also a state. This means that the ability is on cooldown and not yet close enough to being ready again that I would care. This is probably the most controversial of my design choices, and I go into more detail about the intentions in my creation guidelines video, if you're interested. The next state is returning, denoted by a desaturated icon with a white cooldown timer in the center. I decide individually for each ability when to switch from invisible to returning, and the timings can range from 5 seconds for some rotational abilities like Overpower, up to 30 seconds for really big cooldowns like Die by the Sword. There's also no strict rule to it. I instead go by experience. If I find myself missing the optimal time window for an ability in my rotation, I increase the time for the returning state, and if I get annoyed by the icon already being around while it doesn't matter to me, I reduce the time. The fourth state is called unusable and is also shown as a desaturated icon. But in contrast to the returning state, it will either show no cooldown or at least have one charge available in the lower right corner. A skill can be unusable because you lack a target or a resource, or because you're bladestorming right now. There are a lot of potential reasons, but it still shows you that the ability is off cooldown and can be used right away when you fulfill its requirements. The next basic state is running and shows up as a green icon, usually with a yellow timer. It can either represent a buff that the ability applies to you or an ally, or a debuff that the ability applies to an enemy and that usually cannot be refreshed. Finally, the last basic state is out of range, which can also mean that a target is too close for the ability to be used. It shows the icon as deep red, and I only check it for non-melee abilities. Part 1b – Basic States for refreshable abilities. With refreshable abilities, I mean those which usually don't have a cooldown, but can and often should be kept at 100% uptime on the target of choice. The only clear-cut example for this on Arms Warrior is the Rend ability. Rend costs Rage, applies a dot on the enemy target, but has no cooldown. You also want to keep 100% uptime on the dot without wasting a part of your damage on mistimed refreshs. For a refreshable ability like this, there are also 5 basic states. The ready state for refreshable abilities has a normal coloring and signifies that your buff-debuff is not yet on the current target and can be applied to it. There's also an unusable state which uses a desaturated icon. It means that your buff-debuff is missing from the target but still cannot be applied right now because you might be lacking resources or don't fulfill some special requirements for the ability. As soon as the buff-debuff in question is refreshed on the target, the icon will usually turn invisible. This signifies that there's no point in applying it again anytime soon, and you don't need to care about it right now. Then, 3 to 5 seconds before a refresh would be optimal, the icon will reappear in blue with a red timer, warning you that the buff-debuff is running out and that you should fit it into your rotation soon. We call this the bad refresh state. The optimal refresh state, also with a blue icon but with a green timer, is usually active a few seconds before the effect would run out. For those of you who do not know, a dot lasting 12 seconds on initial execution can be refreshed to last up to 15 seconds in order to give players a time window of 3 seconds for reapplication without losing damage. The same is true for HOTS, and this is what the optimal refresh state is all about. So you should have a warning of 3 global cooldowns before your refresh will be optimal, and another 3 global cooldowns to actually execute it. Fitting it into the rotation to achieve lossless 100% uptime is usually very easy like this. Part 1c. Advanced States. Beyond the basic states we have the advanced ones. They all have in common that they refine situational information beyond mere availability and runtime. Their purpose is to provide additional guidance on how useful or efficient the ability might be in the current situation. Keep in mind that this is not a rotation helper. Every ability only cares for its own context and doesn't include other abilities, so multiple abilities may be encouraged at the same time. This approach is leaving the final decision on priority firmly in the hand of the player, needing rotational understanding and situational awareness. It is not meant to decide for you, but rather to condense and refine all given information so that decisions can be made quick and fully informed. Every advanced state has a logic which is specific to the ability, but we still keep visual consistency. The discouraged state has an ability appearing transparent at 50% opacity and signifies that it is available but shouldn't be used. To give an example, the pummel interrupt ability would be discouraged if your current target is not casting an interruptible spell. The encouraged state, on the other hand, has a normally colored icon with a green pixel glow showing around it, and it signifies that the skill is contextually very useful. Going with the pummel example again, it would be encouraged if the enemy is casting an interruptible spell. In fact, pummel is never in the basic ready state. It is only ever encouraged or discouraged. The last common advanced state is essential, signified by the bright shiny blizzard button glow. It is reserved for only the most crucial abilities like Mortar Strike if your Deep Wounds debuff is missing on the target. Basically, there is no point in using another damage ability unless Deep Wounds is applied first. And that concludes all the basic explanations on my ability icons. Let's get back to the main video and into the specifics. Part 2a. Offensive Group Abilities. The first group of abilities, and arguably the most important for a DPS spec, are the offensive or rotational abilities. The group is designed to provide all information you need in order to run an optimal rotation, except maybe for the rage bar itself, but we'll get to that one later. Let us look at the ability icons one by one and start with Colossus Smash. Colossus Smash has no ready state, it only provides discouraged or encouraged states. It is discouraged if there is no Deep Wounds debuff on your target, or if it would last less than 6 seconds. The reason is that you want to be sure that Deep Wounds will not run out during the Colossus Smash window, so you can deal the highest damage possible. 6 seconds are guaranteed to allow a refresh of Deep Wounds with Mortar Strike if necessary. The skill is also discouraged when the Colossus Smash debuff is already on the target, which can happen through one of Shadowlands' legendary effects. If none of the discouraged conditions apply, the ability will use the encouraged state instead, just to signify its importance for the damage rotation. When we spec into Warbreaker instead of Colossus Smash, the only difference is that if you have no target selected, it will default into a ready state, as it can still be used, but lacks information about your intention and the potential targets. Mortar Strike uses 2 advanced states and has the most complicated logic in the Arms Warrior interface. Just look at those triggers here. The first state is essential, signifying that the Deep Wounds debuff is missing on the current target or will run out in the next 2 global cooldowns. The next more important state is encouraged, which is the most complicated one, as there's 3 different contextual situations which each suffice to make the ability encouraged as long as the essential does not apply. Situation A. You already have the maximum 2 stacks of the overpower buff on you and the next overpower buff would get wasted. Situation B. You have the Sharpen Blade buff active and the next Mortar Strike will have a stronger heal reduce. Situation C. Your target is a PvP target and the healing reduce effect of mortal wounds caused by Mortal Strike is missing on the target or about to run out. Any of these situations are enough to encourage the use of Mortal Strike. If neither the essential nor the encouraged states apply and you could still use it, the icon shows as ready. Speaking of Sharpened Blade though, I decided not to make Sharpened Blade its own big icon, because I usually do not execute Sharpened Blade by itself. Sharpened Blade and Mortal Strike can be activated in one single macro, and that is how I use it, so I decided to make it a small addendum to the Mortal Strike icon. It only uses basic states. Moving along, we have Overpower, which doesn't have a running state. Mixing information about up to 2 stacks of the Overpower buff with up to 2 charges of the Overpower ability available was just too convoluted. So the Overpower buff got its own little icon beside Mortal Strike and on the same row where Cleave would be. As for the ability itself, it is discouraged if we already have 2 stacks of the Overpower buff running and encouraged otherwise. If we have the Dreadnought talent spec giving us 2 charges of Overpower, it will only be encouraged if you are at 2 charges or close to 2 charges, because you don't want to waste potential cooldown time. Otherwise, it will just be treated as ready. Then we have Shield Slam, which is encouraged if you have shield block up due to the bonus damage. Shield Slam of course will necessitate swapping weapons, and if you, like me, don't want to update your weapon swap macros every time you have a gear upgrade, I can only advise you to use the add-on which I specifically wrote for that purpose. It is called Weapon Swap Auto Macros and was literally the reason I started this YouTube channel, and you will find a link to the video and the CurseForge page on the description box. With the shilling out of the way, we get to Bladestorm, which has no advanced logic. But if you replace Bladestorm with Ravager, it will try to mimic the basic states of Bladestorm as well, but is much more complicated since you cannot really track the duration of an unchanneled area of effect spell. So I had to build a custom trigger calculating the duration for the running state. It does work fine though. Sweeping Strikes also only has basic states with no specialties. But if you replace Sweeping Strikes with Cleave, things get more interesting. Cleave can inflict deep wounds, just like Mortal Strike, and will also consume the Overpower buff. So it has almost the same logic as Mortal Strike. The only difference is that it doesn't care for the heal reducing mortal wounds debuff, and that it will just show as ready if you have no target selected. Otherwise, there's no difference. Then we have Execute. Execute doesn't have a cooldown, but will still show up as unusable if you have sudden death proc, but cannot use it for some reason, for example because you're Bladestorming. Using your sudden death proc is also always encouraged, while a regular execute will only show up as ready. Shattering Throw has a few advanced states as well. It is basically always discouraged unless your target is under a strong shield effect, which makes the icon appear as ready. If the target even gets an immunity like Divine Shield or Ice Block, it will glow brightly as essential. Skull Splitter is also mostly basic, but will show up as discouraged if you have Deadly Calm active or your rage is too high. The rage is considered too high if one auto attack and the Skull Splitter execution would make you lose some of your gained rage. Rend is following all basic states for refreshable abilities with no special logic beyond that. Then we have Avatar, which is discouraged if there is no deep wounds on the target. And in the same place as Avatar we have Deadly Calm, which is on the same talent row. Deadly Calm gets discouraged if your rage is higher than 80, because even if you trigger abilities back to back, you will probably have 2 more auto attacks in between, bringing your rage total to 130. Wow, that was quite a lot to talk about, but the other groupings are a lot less complicated though. Part 2b, Crowd Control Group Abilities. The first ability in the crowd control group is Hamstring, which uses the default states for refreshable abilities, but only ever tracks on PvP targets. I chose a 3-second time window for optimal refresh, although technically Hamstring doesn't have a grace period. I just don't want my opponent to get away between 2 of my global cooldowns. The only other CC with advanced states is Pummel. Pummel is encouraged if the enemy casts any spell that is interruptible, and discouraged in all other scenarios that are available. And that is really it for the CC group. All other abilities in here, Piercing Howl, Intimidating Shout, Stormbolt, Disarm and Duel, only use basic states. There is also a placeholder icon for Ancient Aftershock, because I will go into Night Fae, but I don't like building for abilities that I cannot yet try out. The next group is even less complicated. Part 2c, Mobility and other group abilities. There are only 2 abilities in here that go beyond basic states. The battle shout buff is essential if you don't have it and otherwise hidden, because why would you ever run around without it? Additionally, it cannot even be removed from you, so mid-combat application doesn't matter. The aggro abilities, Taunt, Heroic Throw and Challenging Shout, only have basic states, though Challenging Shout is not yet built. It only becomes available with level 54, so I have to wait for actual Shadowlands to hit, as I have no beta access. Charge and Heroic Leap are also basic in their logic. For Intervene, the use will be encouraged if your target is below 50% HP, just as a general guideline, but it's nothing fancy. I also have an icon reserved for Soul Shape for when Shadowland comes out. Part 2D, Defensive Group Abilities. In this group we have a little bit more to talk about. First of all, Ignore Pain cannot be refreshed on Arms Warriors due to cooldown, which leads to it only using basic states. For my protection spec, I had to write a fully custom function to know when a refresh for Ignore Pain would be optimal, but that's a story for another video. Hint hint. Now we come to Shield Block. Shield Block is probably one of the weirdest ability icons. All the states are basic, but the 2 charges allow you to execute it again while it's running. So instead of a running state, it mixes in the blue state from refreshable abilities. If the buff is active on you, it will always show the blue refreshable state, with a timer notifying how long the buff will remain. If the timer is red, it means that you cannot use the skill right now. If the timer is green, you have the necessary rage and the necessary charges remaining to extend the duration. But if the buff is not active on you, a white timer will always show the cooldown to the next charge becoming available, even if you already have a charge. Victory Rush is encouraged if you have the necessary buff to use it at all. It is discouraged though if some of the heal would be wasted unless it's very close to running out. Both states will show the remaining time of the necessary buff for you not to miss out on it. If you took the Impending Victory talent instead, then there is no encouraged state, but it will still get discouraged if some of the heal would be wasted. Shadow Melt is the Night Elf racial, which is all basic states except that the running state has no timer, because you can stay melted as long as you want. I am willing to make racials for other races, maybe as a whole little package by itself in the future, if interest is high enough. The last interesting ability from this group is Defensive Stance. So far, it is the only ability which will show a white timer on a green running state. Why? Because Defensive Stance has no maximum duration, but there is a cooldown for switching between stances. So despite the green running icon being active, it will show you with a white cooldown timer when you can switch back to combat stance. All other abilities, Rallying Cry, Die by the Sword, Berserker Rage, Spell Reflection and Warbanner only use basic states, even though Warbanner has a custom trigger for its running state. Part 2E, the state interface. I used the full explanation of my rage bar as an example in my guidelines video to make a point. I will insert it here, so if you have seen it already, feel free to jump to the conclusion of the video. Here we go. A good example for this is the rage bar, which will shift between 4 distinctive states. If the rage bar is literally empty, it is hidden, because not being visible is also a state that can carry information. Here, hidden means that you have no rage, while freeing up more of the game world, and that is always a win. Below 40 rage, the bar will become partly transparent, telling you that your executes are not at full power because they can spend up to 40 rage. Between 40 and 60 rage, the bar will be red with 100% opacity. This signifies that all rage spending abilities can be used at full strength, including execute, but that you shouldn't dump rage into slam yet because you might not have enough rage left over for a full execute afterwards. Above 60 rage, it will turn purple, telling you that you can use slam without endangering an execute or a mortal strike potentially coming off cooldown. But there's even more to it. If you spec into Fervor of Battle, making Whirlwind your main rage dump, then the threshold for purple changes from 60 to 70 automatically. This happens because Whirlwind costs 30 rage in comparison to Slam's 20, so you need 70 rage to have at least 40 left afterwards. On top of this, the whole bar will have a red pixel glow if you have Deadly Calm active, signifying that no rage will be spent on the next ability. And right below the rage bar, we can see the swing timer as close by as possible, carrying the information when our next normal hit will bring in the next batch of rage for you to use. So, just by designing the bar in this way, we have covered the balance between rage gain and rage spending, and encoded all we need to know for Execute, Slam and Whirlwind as rage spenders, and included information for 2 potential talents without any need to waste additional space. Conclusion. So this is my WeakAuras spec interface for arms. When this video comes out, I also have an almost finished interface for Protection Warrior and at least the offensive group ready for Marksman Hunters, simply because I play them. All of my WeakAuras groups for Arms Warriors are available on WAGO.io, and I will update them if I find issues or improvements or if patches change the mechanics, so you can rely on me keeping them up to date. You can find the links in the description box below. Next video should either be about the Prot Warrior WeakAura interface or a short tutorial on how to actually get my groups on your screen, how to move stuff around if you don't like the positions, or how to adjust timings for the returning state of abilities. I even thought about showing a video of the whole process of how I create one of my icons. Just leave me a comment what you would like to see next. At the time of recording, I have a PewDiePie intimidating whopping 16 subscribers, so the chance that your comment decides the outcome is rather high. I hope you find this interface useful or could at least get some inspiration for your own next interface. Thank you for sacrificing your time and have a wonderful day.